Okay, we're about 3 minutes over, and I think we have a majority of the work group here on the call. I'm sure if others plan to join and are running late, they'll jump in and join us. So thank you everyone for joining today's work group meeting. It is our fourth work group meeting for low carbon cement. I do have about 13 observers online as well, and I have the question and answer open. We'll start with a few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar. I'll just ask Chloe to double check, but I believe I see that it is being recorded, so that will go up on our website afterwards.
Yeah, you're good to go.
Perfect, thanks, Chloe. So work group members, as you know by now, you have the ability to take yourself off camera and unmute yourself to make comments throughout the discussion. We will take questions throughout the session. Feel free to use the raise your hand function if that helps put you in the queue, or feel free to interrupt me if you have a burning thought. All other attendees, are known as observers, are online but are in listening mode. So we encourage and ask that observers submit their questions in the Q&A function box. I have been monitoring that for the other work group meetings, and we do have a summary of comments that we're going through. So continue to appreciate your comments and questions from observers as well. We will follow up with via email to answer any questions that we don't get to in the discussion today. So I know a number of observers have been back and forth via email to further discuss comments. And as I mentioned, the slides and recording of the presentation, as usual, will be posted on our website. And I'll just make a note and flag here that we'll try to take a break around an hour and a half or 2 hour mark. So 3-hour call. So I think we have most members on the call, but I'll quickly go through our attendance for work group members. I see David Bagma with Ashgrove is on the call, Jamie Meal with Athena Institute. I don't see Seth Baruch with Carbonomics on. I think he did plan to attend, so maybe just running late. I do see Ram Verma as well. Lauren and Kayla with Climacore are both on the call. I don't see Danny Gray yet, but I believe he planned to attend, so I hope he's not having any Zoom issues, Kayla. I did send him the invite. I do see Dale Prentice is on in replacement at the Institute for Carbon Management at UCLA. Thanks for joining. I see David Perkins with Lehigh is on, Matthew LeMay with National Ready Mix Concrete Association. I see Tom Van Dam is on the call as well. Thanks for joining. I don't think I saw Christina or Lauren with NRDC yet, but I believe Lauren said she was available, so maybe she's just on her way. I believe I saw Eric join the call. Oh yeah, Eric's on from Portland Cement Association. Miguel from Ruby Canyon Environmental, thanks for joining. And I did also see James with Salt River Materials Group and Jimmy with CFA Group. Thanks everyone for joining. It looks like we've got a good turnout. A couple of people running late or not able to attend today, but of course we do have the recording so they can follow up and make comments. Today's agenda, we're primarily focusing on the latter half of the draft protocol. As you know, over the last few calls, we focused a lot on project eligibility and those sections. I think now we are in a position to move on to protocol considerations under the assessment boundary, as well as quantification, and then the required monitoring, reporting, and verification that would be proposed to go along with that quantification. So that should be the bulk of our discussion today, but I have included a few follow-up slides, a couple items if we do have time that we would put your attention to and ask for comment. Any questions, comments, thoughts from the work group before we get started on the discussion? Okay, not hearing any. We did revise the GHG boundary based on comments at our last work group meeting. So as you'll recall, there were some comments on the inclusion of cement within the GHG boundary. And so we did take another look at it and appreciate help from Climeco as well in discussions around their original proposal. Basically, the only changes that were made were that we included an SSR 8 emissions from end of life waste. As well as added in a couple more SSRI definitions, all in an attempt to align with the life cycle analysis and EPD studies. So currently, the end of the GHG assessment boundary is as soon as the material is in its cementitious form, whether it be Portland cement or some other ACM or SCM product, and that we're excluding the transportation of that cementitious product to the ready mix facilities. So that's the kind of end of the GHG assessment boundary. We would not, as currently proposed, consider transportation emissions or the emissions required to then mix, do the ready mix process and further, transport or send to its final end product destination and recycling. I will pause and ask for questions. I don't know, Kayla or Lauren, if you wanted to add anything, background information to that, but generally speaking, it's our understanding that we wanted to align with the EPD as was discussed at the last work group meeting, and that this would really be the basis for the baseline emissions and project emissions that would be compared for this protocol, excluding additional emissions that would be deemed similar based on the end use.
I did have one question, and it may be off the wall, but some of these materials are actually sequestering CO2, right? I mean, and it's not unforeseeable. There's some of them that will sequester quite a bit. So I know we talked about emissions, and I guess you can have negative emissions, right? Is that how it's dealt with? And then it's also possible that they might actually lead to greater carbonation in service. So I just want to throw that on the table and how we would deal with that. If we have a material that is sequestering CO2 in the manufacturing process, as well as maybe additional sequestration of CO2 in service.
Yeah, great question, Tom. Thank you. I think we are proposing it in the quantification that if the material did also sequester carbon, that would be potentially an add-on of the baseline emissions. So you would have, you'd have your baseline Portland cement emissions that you'd be comparing to, and then your project emissions would be the result of displacing the clinker, whatever that product may be. And then if that product in itself also removes or sequesters carbon, we're proposing like a plus CO2 captured in another equation for that. So theoretically you could, as proposed, gain credits for both. Good question, though. I think as we were thinking about that, question marks have come up around what that could change or alter for the assessment boundary. Obviously, we don't in here have any like CO2 captured or CO2 transported, anything like that. So we would maybe have to consider that. Is it, or would it fall under emissions of like raw materials, CO2? I'm not sure. Does that answer your question? Or
yeah, I think that, like I said, I know there are a number of these products that are already, in pilot stage that would probably want to call out on that maybe more specifically. But as long as we don't throw up a barrier, as long as it's accommodated, that would be great.
Perfect. Thank you. Matthew?
I actually, Thomas, I have a question for you, kind of as part of this. By taking account of carbon sequestration, did you mean carbon sequestration before the product goes in, like in a mineralized product, like a carbon cure? Or did you mean sequestration that comes from a result of carbonation in the end product phase as concrete?
Well, the one that I was thinking of is there are products that people are manufacturing now that actually utilize atmospheric carbon dioxide in the process of creating the product.
Right.
So that's one type. The other type, of course, is that once in service, some of these products have been shown to, undergo additional carbonation beyond what the Portland cement would carbonate. So it would be an add-on in service. So our boundary, as it's shown, is really only around the product itself. But I just feel that it's important I know it would be accommodated in here because it would come in as an add-on, but it would be almost nice to show that that could be a real positive. That's all.
Yeah, and I just wanted to
And
say,
not the carbon, I wasn't thinking of a carbon cure product.
but sure, right. I go to it because it's, I guess, the ubiquitous example of one that incorporates carbon dioxide in manufacturing.
Yes, the manufacturing process of the concrete. And there are those of us, I don't want to say it, but we would still, well, even carbon cure says this, they don't actually sequester a lot of CO2.
Right.
Very, 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 very little. But they have other benefits that they claim as far as reducing cementitious content.
Avoid emissions, right?
So anyway, but there are other products, like I think you know of them, that use CO2 in the processing to create the product itself.
Right. I would just say that it would actually be very it would be relatively easy to include within this boundary carbon that is sequestered or mineralized as part of manufacturing the product, as in that carbon comes out of the atmosphere and is put into this SCM, right? And it would already be taken out of the atmosphere in that state. It would be much harder to capture increased carbonation in concrete, right? If the product, like you said, promoted carbonation, more carbon uptake in the concrete phase, it would be harder, not impossible, because there are quantification methods for carbonation. But I just want to make that distinction that it can come from two sources. One, I think, is a no-brainer for inclusion in this boundary as it exists, because the carbonation is already done, by the time we reach SSR 9 here on the map. The other is much more difficult, and it comes actually after installation, right? Over the lifetime of the concrete as it absorbs from the atmosphere.
Exactly.
So much further down the road.
Yep, you've captured my comments perfectly, and I would agree with you 100%. That should be probably captured within the concrete PCR.
Right. So just two different types of carbonation.
So just to be clear, the kind of intended addition of like the carbonation in the process that would potentially credit removals during the manufacturing process would be fairly easy to quantify and add and credit. But the more like the natural occurring carbonation that just happens with concrete over time is what you're referring as the difference would be kind of excluded as it's SSR 13 onward.
I would say so. It would come in between SSR 13 and SSR 14 because it comes during the lifespan. The difficulty with it is, we've done calculations and estimates for carbonation of concrete in use, and you have to know whether it's going to be exposed or not, right? If it's in ground, it's not going to be exposed to CO2, if it's below grade, and that way, so you need to know the final application down to the level of what the building looks like.
Okay.
You need to know its surface area and all of those things. And I think that is, again, I've been an advocate for involving the concrete producer in validating the process and getting data from that end and bring it back. That I think would be very onerous and difficult to prove on the protocol because it would be different for every single building and the applications of different concretes in that building. Now, if it was possible to, I don't know, produce an LCA or an EPD for concrete, generic concrete, average using not, a baseline, and then concrete using an SCM product, which promotes carbonation, and measure the difference, I think maybe there's an argument to be had there. But as is, that doesn't exist. That's not existing data that we can draw on. And to right, it's just two different stages, and one takes place before SSR 9. It depends on the product where it would come in here, but definitely within the boundary. And the other takes place way beyond the boundary.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Jamie?
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at this assessment boundary, and it's very cementitious oriented as opposed to concrete oriented. And I look at things like SSR 10 and 11, and these are things that are typically included in a ready mix concrete EPD. So if EPDs are somehow driving this and are going to be used as a basis for some of these emission factors, just to put everything on the same baseline. And I'm also thinking that most of these SCMs, novel or new and old, are actually introduced at the ready mix plant more so than in the cement plant, i.e. in terms of blended cements. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying SR 10 and 11 should actually be within the boundary of the assessment. And I also think that's going to help later on in terms of the verification, monitoring, and the quantification. So that's where I'm at.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, that's something I definitely struggled with, and is exactly what you're saying, if 10 and 11 should be included in the boundary or not. I think it goes without saying, or to any changes to this, that we are pushing for verification up to the ready mix facility, in the sense that the product made it to the ready mix facility and was used, without potentially looking at the emissions to mix the cementitious material to form that blended cement, since the emission difference would be the displacement of the Portland cement clinker product. But definitely open to comments. I think it's our understanding that, like, the transportation of that material and then the emissions to mix that material to create a concrete product would be relatively similar to Portland cement, that the real emission difference is that the product is different itself. But I definitely hear what you're saying in terms of the verification that this product has actually made it to the concrete ready mix facility. It has actually displaced Portland cement to achieve the emission reductions.
This is Eric Giannini at PCA. I mean, the existence of batch tickets that come out of ready mix facilities are, that's a very good tool for verification that something has actually been used to replace Portland cement in a mix that's been sent out from the plant. And these records have to be kept. That they accompany every delivery, and a lot of them are electronic these days. So that makes it even more feasible to track quickly and verify.
Okay, thanks, Eric. And I guess I see, Lauren, your hand up just quickly. Is it your understanding that the emissions from transportation of the cementitious material and mixing of the cementitious material at the ready mix facility is relatively similar, or would there be differences between like an FCM product or traditional Portland cement product for both those? I guess trying to piece out that they would be verifiable steps without like quantification steps, if you will. So
I
just
guess-
something to think about. Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Lauren.
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in and say that we did some research on this, and candidly, there's not perfect information, particularly on some of these SSRs, but we found no reason to believe that emissions would be different. So that's one of the reasons why we felt comfortable excluding them. So I guess for clarity, these SSRs 10 through 14, it's not that they're not important, it's just that we think there won't be kind of a meaningful quantifiable difference between the project, which would be Portland cement moving into concrete, or sorry, the baseline, which is Portland cement moving into concrete, and the project, which is kind of a mix that includes alternative SEMs moving into concrete. So there's not a lot of use in quantifying those. And then last point, I just wanted to echo certain some folks talking about the carbonation component. I agree. I think kind of the sequestered carbon over time, that's out of bounds for this methodology. It doesn't make sense. And if we get better data in the future, we can always update the methodology. This is, or the protocol. This doesn't have to be the final version. And I also do want to be a little cautious about including the injected CO2, just because it does create more quantification and verification requirements on the front end. If you're capturing that CO2 from direct air capture, CCUS, that can be kind of a whole separate effort. So there is already a Vera protocol for that. So I guess I just want to flag there's already an existing pathway. So I don't want to get too complicated here when there's already a path. But I don't have any problem with it in like fundamentally. I think it does make sense in general.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. James?
Yeah, I guess I was gonna comment on, we have a chain of custody on several of our SEMs where it is tracked all the way to the batch port. So you know that the material ended up in an encapsulated state within concrete. I mean, the record keeping, literally every pound that leaves the facility of the harvesting materials tracked all the way to its end use. We can go back to the utility and prove out our CC&Rs that it was used for beneficial use. So the quality of that data is extraordinary and real and live and current today.
Okay, that's great to hear. I think that'll prove like very useful for verification when we are looking at that too. Thanks. Danny?
Thanks. Relative to the transport, I think the reason for having it outside the boundary is that as an SCM manufacturer, when a customer truck comes and picks up an SCM truckload of material, there's a weight ticket that establishes that it's going, and there's a reasonable assumption that if someone buys and pays for that product to replace cement, that it will end up in the end product. So there's your measuring point. The transport to the end user is really a decision of the end user, because if the customer is picking it up, he or she may decide to take it to one of many different ready-mix plants, as an example. Just like they would choose where they buy their cement, they would choose where they buy their SCM. If in a perfect economy, they would use the one that has the lowest emissions, and theoretically that would be the lowest cost in the embedded concrete at some point, but that's not necessarily so. So the decision on the transport in many cases, in almost most cases, is going to be outside of the boundary of the SCM manufacturer.
Okay, thanks for that context. Seth?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on the previous comment around carbonation. I would just say that while there is actually two methodologies that do allow for that, they're both pretty limited in their own ways. One only deals with biogenic CO2 and the use of that in concrete aggregates, and the Vera methodology is limited to ready mix, doesn't include additives, aggregates, et cetera. So I think the opportunity here is to expand eligibility, since already the market and technologies have moved so much since the Vera protocol was first drafted a few years ago. And I certainly acknowledge that there are some upfront efforts that have to be taken into account in terms of the CO2 source and confirming its eligibility, et cetera. But certainly we've seen a lot of project developers willing to go that extra mile to make that happen, at least in the case of the Vera methodology. So I just wanted to offer that thought.
Thanks, Seth. Matthew?
Yeah, I just wanted to second a comment in the Q&A from Sam Raid. It says SSR 10 could be very different depending on where the material is coming from and how it's getting there. I do see those other arguments that it is down to the end user, for example, the concrete producer, or cement, if it's blended cement, on where they're sourcing it. However, I do want to point out that on average there is going to be a significant difference for a given innovative ACM SCM that's eligible for this credit versus what we're considering it to be replacing. Either if you consider another fly ash, an unbeneficiated fly ash, for example, or a cement. And the reason is going to be that an innovative product is not going to have facilities everywhere, right? It's likely to have limited a breadth in the market, and so you're going to have to source it from further away because you don't have a concrete a cement plant down the road. So you are going to have on average higher A2 emissions, unless your only customers are extremely local, which I don't think would be the goal, right? But it is a reality of growing its business and all of this, that there's going to be less geographic availability for a new product, and I think you are going to see higher A2 on the whole than the product that it's replacing.
Okay, that's helpful.
And sorry, I realize I used an EPD terms. A2 is transportation, to the plant of a material that would line up with our SSR 10 on this.
Okay. And then I guess SSR 11 is more where everyone can agree that those emissions to blend is likely similar versus the overall potential increased average for transportation with limited supply.
I would say so.
Okay. James, did you still have your hand up, or was that from before? Oh, okay. Kayla?
Thanks, Mackenzie. I did just want to comment on the transportation piece. This is certainly something we thought a lot about. And through our research, we know that Portland cement can travel, up to 100 miles to get to a ready mix facility. But our understanding is that these innovative SCM plants are smaller and can actually be located closer to the end user. So we do expect those emissions to be, at least similar, if not less. And I guess just to give an example of one specific type of SCM we're looking at, like fly ash, harvested fly ash, and beneficiated ash. If you just look at a map of the cement plants in the US and compare that to a map of where fly ash is, there's a lot more fly ash opportunity than there are cement plants. So I think, that's just one example of how we think it could be less.
Okay, thanks. Miguel?
Yeah, thanks, Mackenzie. Yeah, it's related to the comment that Lauren did before about this taking out the CO2 from the quantification. That made me realize that maybe we will have to be aware of whether the CO2 comes from another project of capturing and storing that CO2, because in that case, that could be a risk of double counting if that CO2 is part of another project. I don't know if this is included or thought about this in the methodology.
Yeah, great question. We thought of that as well. It's we currently don't have a methodology or carbon credit opportunity for captured CO2 generally, so it wouldn't be an issue within our work. I'm not aware of any functioning. I'd have to double check, but I'm not aware that other registries have a functioning CCS methodology. I imagine it would be treated, without the ability to stack as we normally do at this point. But it's something to keep in mind, definitely, Miguel, that it's similar to biochar, I guess, right? It's a potential product for the SCM in this methodology, but we are at the reserve also working on a methodology for biochar sequestering carbon. So that's an example of how some may overlap. It would maybe be similar.
Yes, because I think if this CO2 comes from a project that is already claiming some emission reductions in another, in this one and in another registry, yeah, that probably the chain of custody has to be reviewed.
Agreed. Yeah. Thank
Thanks.
you. Jamie?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on SSR 11. While I agree that the mixing is probably going to be the same, what this does in terms of including it is ensures that we're not just producing a novel SCM, it's actually being used. And those batch tickets are going to be very important in terms of that verification side. And to me, I don't think an SCM manufacturer should get credit, or that credit is actually verified, until it's actually proven to be used as opposed to produced. And I think that's where I'm getting a little hung up.
Makes sense. Okay, no, that's helpful. It makes sense. I'm hearing SSR 10 and 11 are still like a question mark from the group. There's, opinions on both sides, it sounds like, but definitely I think everyone can agree the verification is key and the batch tickets are key. But I hear your point in terms of ensuring it's, not just produced, but used. And then the other side as well, that maybe they're not that different from an emission perspective. So do we need to quantify them? But I'm making a note with a star here of SSR 10 and 11. David?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to add some additional commentary on the transportation piece. To kind of reflect what Kayla had mentioned as well. There's quite a bit of variability in terms of cement being transported, and it can go several hundred miles, and even in the case of imports, several thousand. So I think, to make a broad brush, presumption that these SCMs are going to travel farther distances is probably going to be not completely accurate. It will in some cases. All that to say, I just want to add that for the record to make sure that this, is a good whole discussion around the comparative impacts of the transportation piece to the ready mix facility. That said, I really don't have a strong opinion one way or the other in terms of these, but I think it just does point to that there is some substantial similarity between that transport portion and what we are going to see with these other materials. But again, it's not complete and perfect information. So it may make sense to include those just so you've got an apples to apples comparison.
Yeah, that's sort of that's a good way to conclude that, David. That's sort of where my mind is going from a GHG accounting perspective. We don't really know yet, it sounds like, as well. There's some comments in the chat around, although, the innovative material plants may be smaller, maybe beneficiated ash is one case example, but what about natural pozzolans and where they exist and transportation of those? So it sounds like there's some general information, but not necessarily a full picture maybe to draw that it would be de minimis, and there may be differences. So it's a point well taken, and still have that SSR 10 and 11 starred. And I don't want to cut off comments. I am just being mindful of time. Maybe we want to spend another 10 minutes or so on this slide and move on if that works for the group. But I see, Tom, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's just typical reflects the the way things lag through a system, but I was gonna similarly comment that David did. I mean, I would make no assumption whatsoever on the size of the manufacturing and the location, as well as mode, right? I mean, just because the cement comes 300 miles, if it's shipped by barge from near St. Louis, that's a heck of a lot better than trucking it 50. So same with these materials. So I think that SR10 is going to be important. I just wouldn't make any assumption on size of plant and the distribution. I think, ultimately the transport's got to be covered.
Thanks, Tom. Jimmy? You might be on mute, Jimmy. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I apologize.
It's okay.
From our perspective, 10 is, we don't haul a great distance. So when we do this with legacy ash, and we probably haul a shorter distance, kind of what Kayla was saying earlier. Excuse me. So it really doesn't matter one way or the other, I suppose. It makes more sense following up with what Danny said to us to put it in there in that boundary. So I understand what everybody else is saying. It's interesting to me when we get to 11, I'm still, is the expectation for this work group or the consensus of expectation that this will be verified by every individual yard of concrete batched? We'd have batch tickets and all that stuff. I mean, what Danny had suggested earlier, Danny Gray in his comments, is we could do the verification as you load tankers of material where they're all going to the same destination. It'll be a concrete plant, a concrete producer. If we load to somebody who's not a concrete producer, you wouldn't account for that. To us, that makes a good sense. That makes good sense to do it there. But if we start going to each individual, if we have to verify by looking at every yard of concrete that's batched and how much ash was or how much cement was displaced by looking at, I guess, a baseline cement mix, I can't even imagine how that accounting would take place, in terms of its verification. Is that what the consensus is, or is the consensus more like what Danny was saying, where as it's being shipped? And when I read the Kleinco position paper, I kind of got the impression it was more like as it's being shipped away from a beneficiation facility, that would be the cutoff. But when you extend the boundary beyond that, it just seems like it would be a logistic nightmare. But I was hoping that y'all could help clarify that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. I think you positioned that quite well. I think the intent of the methodology, as I understand it, is that displacement and the production and purchase of that SCM with the intent that it would be used instead of the more emission intensive Portland cement product. I think what the work group and ourselves at the reserve are struggling with is the accounting perspective and how to, with reasonable assurance, verify that that product was used and was displaced and actually did result. It wasn't just the intent of the produced SCM, but it was actually used and displaced Portland cement and therefore created that emission reduction. And I think we can all probably agree that if someone's buying an SCM product, they're not just doing that for fun. They're likely buying it to use instead of Portland cement as a cementitious project, as a product. But we are challenged from an offset registry standpoint to ensure that that's verifiable. And so I think that's where the consensus is, on either side of how do we do that with limited administrative burden, like you mentioned, but also reasonable assurance that we have something tangible and verifiable that we can say this makes sense.
Well, let me say again, we have a phone-based app at every batch plant. The load leaves the harvested site, and even if it's diverted from one batch plant to another, it gets scanned when it gets delivered, so the truck arrived to the batch plant, and that's your verification that it went into concrete as a replacement for Portland cement. So it isn't just as it leaves the plant, but you can take the chain of custody and prove that the load went to a beneficiation qualifying spot, as opposed to getting in an accident or being diverted to a landfill. If you have electronic proof and it's not burdensome. It's a little bit of work, but it's not burdensome, and that technology is happening right now every day in the cementation field.
So with that comment, James, then would like the, SCM producers on the line or folks in general, would that, electronic proof of arrival at the ready mix concrete plant, I guess, right, of that cementitious material, would that be a way to verify that it's, made it to the ready mix facility, it's going to be used there, and also potentially
90% of the time you need that for invoice, right? So
right.
it's not much more burden. In it, with the CCRs and the beneficiation use versus non-beneficiation use, this kind of clarification is really almost just a tad bit more than invoice. So that's available. So it's a little bit more than just leaving the plant. You can prove where it got, and it's not crashing the system with data. And but you're also not taking the next step and showing every yard of concrete where all the concrete goes, because that's not any added value going that way.
Right. So I agree. That makes sense. So would those batch tickets or electronic slips then of it making it to the ready mix facility, would that also provide distance for transport, or is that, what are your thoughts on that?
It's me again. Yeah, I mean, you get all the GPS data out of it, all the modern stuff. You have 1,000 trucks, over some period of time leaving the facility, and where all 1,000 of them ended up, right? And it's all kind of electronic through scanning systems, and you need that for invoicing, but you also need that for proof that you used it beneficially, and that's what you're asking for. So you have that, then you have the proof that it went into a batch plant, and logically you can assume that it was used in a cement replacement process. Why else would it go there, right? I mean, it's got no purpose but that. So you could get protocols around that sort of endpoint efficiency and without disrupting the models that are in place now.
Thanks, James. That's helpful. Jimmy?
Oh, sorry, I forgot to take my hand down.
Oh, no problem. Danny?
Yeah, thanks. I think when a user of the SCM sends a truck and purchases the material at the manufacturing plant or the distribution terminal, and that ticket is issued, that's a pretty doggone good indicator that that material is going to be used. As you said earlier, they're not going to spend the money that it costs to buy the material and send a truck to pick it up unless they're going to use it as a replacement for cement, because that's what it's used for. There might be, one truck out of 30,000 that would have an accident and cause the material to be diverted somewhere besides into the silo at the ready mix manufacturing plant. So I think it's better to set it outside the boundary. The weight ticket is the measurement and is easy to track, whether it's you track it at the end of the manufacturer where the truck leaves with the material, or I guess in James's case where it shows up. If you were to try to track it to every cubic yard of concrete, as Jimmy says, in this industry, that information is not readily available it's not readily available to us. So I would assume it's probably not readily available and shown by ready mix producers, unless it's maybe they show that to specific jobs that are DOT jobs. But outside of that, the weight ticket is the measurement. It is the proof. People don't buy a truckload of SCMs and then not use them. They when they haul it off at the site, the manufacturing site, you're pretty doggone sure that they're going to use it to replace cement when they get to the other end. So.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I appreciate that. I think similar to my comments before, I'll say, I think we can agree that's the case. It's just from a protocol and accounting perspective, how we verify that and what the documentation is. So, Matthew?
Yeah, just, you know, in response, Danny, I think you're correct there that if you sell, you know, a truckload of SCM, it's going to be used. However, oh, Sam, thank you. Just put in the Q&A. This is exactly where I was going. It's the assumption of one-to-one replacement, I think. I don't think anybody's assuming that like fraud or waste is taking away from the you know, application of these into concrete or into cement. I guess the question of the fact that it's replacing cement is my question. NRMCA has got data. I've sent this to Mackenzie. I can share it with the group as well if there's an avenue to do so. On how much cement versus fly ash versus slag. That's what we track at the moment. We're expanding this because there are more products on the market now in future versions, is used in a typical mix. And we do this by strength class and by region. So, you know, we'll be dealing with, you know, 2,000 to 3,000, you know, PSI mixes, 3,000 to 4,000 PSI mixes, et cetera. For each of those groups, and in 8 regions of the country, we've got data on how much cement is used on average and gross production versus how much SCM. And you know, the SCM numbers are going to be around 15 to 20% on average. And so most of those are going to be fly ash. So let's say 15% fly ash because it's a good round number. If the typical concrete in a region, if 15% of its cementitious materials is going to be fly ash and not cement, and let's just take slag out of the equation for now, and you consume, you know, a given amount of beneficiated fly ash, I think my concern is that it's not going to be a one-to-one replacement because the first use, I mean, the natural use of beneficiated fly ash would be to replace traditional fly ash, you know, in part or in whole, you know. So I don't think what's happening is going to be that people are producing a concrete mix that uses some percentage of fly ash already, and what they're going to do is bring in an innovative SCM material and then replace only cement, but let's say they're using that 15% fly ash still. You see where if they used 20% of their cementitious came from an innovative material, and they produced a mix that was the same as their you know, basic mix, which uses 15% fly ash, that they're really only replacing 5% of the cement contents rather than 20. Because I think one of the first uses is going to be to replace, you know, replace other SCMs, replace fly ash. And so that's why I think it's a different part of the quantification, but it's something that we touched on, is that I don't think we can assume that there's going to be a one-to-one replacement. And I think we do have to validate that from the end user at the concrete plant on some level, that we're replacing Portland cement, right? We're replacing cement is the goal here, to somehow validate that we're replacing cement. Because if I remember right, that was the assumption. I believe, that we heard from the beginning, is that the goal is to replace cement.
So I can jump in here. I see Mackenzie jumping around. So I do think this is, I assuming she's going to say is a good segue to quant, because I think this is probably just a new topic, but an important one. So when we designed the protocol, one of the things that we felt was a fundamental assumption, which is that there is a dwindling supply of these classic SCMs or legacy SCMs, whatever you want to call them, the fresh fly ash. And since the reason why generally people purchase fly ash or other SCMs is because they cost less, there might be some other reasons, but if they're now going to purchase these alternative SCMs, they're going to cost more. And the reason they're going to do that is because fly ash isn't available. So if the products didn't exist in the market, their option would be Portland cement. So that's why our assumption is people aren't just saying like, oh, you know, what am I going to do? Buy fly ash, or am I going to buy this novel product? It's the fly ash isn't available. What am I going to do now? Right. So that's what we're working with as the assumption, why we put it as a one-to-one replacement.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Matthew. Yeah, I think it is a good segue into quantification and some of the things we'll need to consider for baseline emissions and the assumption that it would just be replacing the Portland cement, not other types of cementitious materials that are currently being used. So that's definitely an important conversation. Maybe I have two more hands, and then maybe we'll move on to the quantification. Tom, you're next on my list.
Yeah, and mine's related to this discussion, and because it's a very important one. I mean, the reality is at least in my experience, is most batch plants will run 2 silos, right? One with a Portland cement or a blended cement product, almost universally either Portland cement or a blended type 1L cement. And the second silo is filled with an SCM, most commonly fly ash. What I could see happening here very easily, if the fly ash is still available, is as we quantify the carbon footprint, make this simple, of our alternative SCM, what you probably would do is then increase the carbon footprint of the concrete being produced, because they're not going to take an extra 5% out. They're going to do the same thing that they would do with the fly ash, unless it's a very, very effective SCM. So it's a very interesting, important thing, but I guess we don't want unintended consequences here, how we handle this, because fly ash, my understanding is generally assumed as waste. And so other than the cost of transportation, there's really no additional processing. It doesn't come with any of the carbon footprint of burning of the coal. So just a point of discussion, and maybe that just took us into the ditch. I'm not sure.
No, it needs to come up. So fair enough. I think it's somewhere between the assessment boundary and quantification, because we are assuming the baseline, as being Portland cement, and that these products will be replacing that. There's no, to my knowledge, ability to assess if it's replacing a traditional fly ash product or limestone cement or other things. So that's something I'll jump to so we can discuss that. Danny, maybe last comment on this slide before we move on.
Sure, I'll make it quick. I think I'll reinforce Lauren's comment. The cornerstone assumption is that fly ash will not be available on a long-term basis. And in general, where you would be harvesting and beneficiating materials is going to be because there wasn't a supply that was economical or reasonably priced economic radius from your facility. So I think when the assumption is that beneficiated ash is the case, it's harvested and used, it's because it's filling a void that was there because fly ash did disappear in a particular market, and that's why it's coming back into the market. So I think the cornerstone assumption, as Lauren said, is that number one, fly ash is disappearing in many locales, and so the goal is to try to incentivize bringing back the carbon reduction. So that the one silo may be sitting empty because you may not have an SCM available at that location, and bringing back something to serve in that role through beneficiation is the goal. So.
Right. I wonder if there's any mechanism to verify that that's the position the purchaser is in. I'm not sure if that's too complicated. Matthew?
To that, I would just say that, I think the assumption that the lack of availability of traditional SCMs is going to be the main driver is not correct. Concrete companies do produce green and low carbon concrete, because the goal is to produce low carbon concrete. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Many projects have low carbon targets that they're trying to meet, and that's the reason that they're consuming a material. And I think it would be shortchanging innovative SCMs to assume that they're not going to have potentially better performance than traditional SCMs. It might be the case that one of these materials can achieve a higher percentage of cement replacement in your intended application. And that would be the reason that the concrete producer would be consuming it, not just the lack of availability of fly ash, right? So I don't think that is necessarily a fair assumption that fly ash will become less or unavailable and one of these materials will come in to replace it, therefore it can always be said to be replacing Portland cement. I just don't think that's the case. Even now, when there are squeezes on availability of fly ash, a lot of it is seasonal. because the large demand, from construction consumes all the fly ash available in the market at the time, and then it comes back later. We see SCMs, slag and fly ash shipped in from overseas in countries where the market isn't shifting in that direction toward the unavailability of fly ash. Now, that might make a cost, motivator to consume an innovative SCM anyway. However, not guaranteed. And so I think it does have to be part of the validation to determine how much cement are we really replacing? Are we replacing cement, or are we replacing something else? Because the dwindling availability of fly ash, one, I don't think is a guarantee, and two, isn't the only motivation for a concrete company to use another SCM.
Thanks, Matthew. So you'll notice I jumped down to quantification. I think we're starting to talk about that, so I do think it's a good segue. But I did just want to summarize to my best ability the conversations we've had to date on the previous GHG assessment boundary slide, just to make sure I haven't missed any main themes. I am looking at the chat function as well from observers, and there's a lot of comments in line with these outcomes, I think. So the first I have is that we need to revisit the inclusion or exclusion of the SSRR 10 and 11. That's transport of the cement material to the ready mix facility and mixing of that. I think both from sort of the verification, quality of the credit, those types of questions, I don't think we've really landed on that they need to or don't need to be included, but it seems like there's opinions on either side of the argument. So I've highlighted that we need to, as a work group, further review and come to a consensus on that. The second point I have, which is probably not as big of a change, but still on the table, is the CO2 removals or injection. If we are including that within the quantification as a viable option to generate credits, is there anything in the GHG assessment boundary as per like where the captured carbon comes from, those types of things that would need to be edited? And the last one is this, one-to-one replacement or assumption that the SCM would replace the Portland cement directly, and some of the commentary that's been had at the end of this discussion around that. Kind of last call, I guess, a bit on the GHG assessment boundary. Are there any main themes or main takeaways that I've missed and need to add on to the list as potential edits, or are folks comfortable moving on to the quantification? Okay, I don't see any hands, but appreciate all your comments. Thank you. Maybe we'll start into quantification, and then depending on where we're at, I can offer a short break. I'll start on this slide. I think this is pretty straightforward. I don't know that there'll be any comments or edits on, the high level emission reduction equation. It's simply the difference in, the baseline emissions from the project emissions. And, what this net difference would equal is the total emission reductions, which would then be the total number of credits that would be issued based on that equation. I think there'll be more comments when we dive into the details on what the baseline emission equation is and how we determine that. Same with project emissions. But generally speaking, for your context, if you didn't see it in the draft protocol, this is the top of the umbrella, if you will, of how this is all calculated and what emission reductions would be reported and therefore credited. Any comments, thoughts, questions on this slide before I move on? This is a general schematic that just gives you an idea of all the equations that sort of fit under these two. So as you recall, the emission reduction, it requires a BE, a baseline emissions, and a PE, project emissions, and then these are determined with a series of other equations. I'll note, and we'll get to a slide on this for baseline emissions, there's a hierarchy approach of data availability. So if you as a project developer did not have plant specific, facility specific numbers for the Portland cement facility, which is potentially unlikely or probably unlikely, which should be further discussed. If you did have that information, you could calculate all of these by facility specific information and use that as a comparison. But there is a proposal to use EPDs or regional data in replacement of that, which we'll get to at a later slide. Similarly for project emissions, but a bit different, this would be at the SCM or ACM facility. It's the emissions associated with generating the product that's going to replace the baseline product. And so that would include everything from mining and transportation of your necessary raw materials into additive emissions, as well as just the simple production emissions during the project for that SCM. So that's it's just a schematic to kind of show you in a single slide what all equations and numbers and data metrics would have to go in to come up with these two numbers that would then give you the difference. I don't see any hands up, so I'll keep going into baseline since I think that's where we were headed in the previous discussion. The total emissions for the baseline is from, and I still have OPC, so PC, Portland Cement. It would be mining of the emissions for Portland Cement, the Portland production emissions, including calcination, and then transportation emissions as well from that production. And then you'll see in red right now, this is a potential edit that the baseline emissions would have potentially captured CO2. So we'll still need to look at that. And I might have put that on the wrong slide, so I'll have to look again. This is what I was talking about in terms of a hierarchy approach. I think I'll pause on this slide. This is where we would need an emission factor, apologies, for the CO2 emissions from Portland cement production for the reporting period. These are like the other parts of the equation here, the total quantity and the weight adjustment factor should be, I think more simple to include in the equation versus, the actual CO2 emissions that occurred. So as I mentioned, there are calculations that have been provided for each one of these: mining, production, transportation. But without the information from a Portland cement facility, what were their emissions for mining the products? What were their emissions for producing it? Fossil fuels, electricity usage, same thing for transportation. The idea is that we could lean on the estimated emission factors from the EPDs. So I'll pause here. I think I would ask the group to continue your discussion and thoughts on using Portland cement as a baseline. Is that correct? Given some of the assumptions and commentary that's been said on the call to date, where does limestone cement come in? Where does traditional fresh fly ash use and displacement of that come in? So I think comments on that assumption and the way these calculations are written for Portland cement would be great to hear, as well as then your thoughts on the ability to get historical plant facility specific data on mining, production, and transportation of Portland cement. Is that possible, impossible? And then what are the opportunities with the EPDs that exist? Are those accurate enough? Are those available enough? I think so, but looking to hear from the group on both of those things. So I'll pause and open up the floor for discussion. I hope that's a good segue. And I see Jimmy has his hand up, so we'll start with you.
Well, and to pick up where we left off in the earlier conversation, really, from our perspective, we sell both in the same market area. The beneficiated harvested material that's beneficiated goes to the marketplace, and we sell fresh fly ash. All the fresh fly ash is sold first. I mean, it's all gone. The amount of fresh ash that's being produced is way less than what the demand is in the marketplace. which is why we have these beneficiation facilities, why they exist. We are running out of supply of both, but regardless, the first stuff to go to be used in the marketplace is the fresh fly ash, because it's lower, it is poorer quality, but it's priced because of that poorer quality. It has more, it's more difficult for the concrete producer to use it. So it is a slightly lower price, but it does go first. So there isn't like there's fresh fly ash being displaced by the 1 million tons of the legacy ash that we're putting into this marketplace in the Carolinas. So I don't know what, I mean, I understand Matthew's point, and maybe there's area where everybody's limited by their experience. The fresh fly ash is the first to be to go market.
Sorry, if you're not talking or do you mind putting yourself on mute, please?
That's my fault. Sorry about that.
No, no problem. Thanks, Jim.
Am I up? James.
I think Jimmy, did you have anything else you wanted to add? I think you were kind of mid-end thought.
Yeah, that was pretty much the end of it. I just wanted to kind of reinforce. I think that's the assumption by most of the marketers of ash, that's the dynamic that's in the marketplace where beneficiated ash is introduced. It's more expensive. People buy the cheapest stuff first. I mean, it's just pretty simple. And we just don't, and we even have seasonal storage where we're putting the production ash in a dome so that when it's produced in excess amount, we're able to store it up, and we still end up emptying the dome. I mean, every year, I mean, all the fresh ash that we can get into the hands of our concrete producers, the customers, they get it. And I just wanted to kind of emphasize that point. So thanks.
Thanks, Jimmy. James, you're up.
Yeah, Jimmy, I apologize up front, but I just, that's a very isolated market you're talking about. It's not the way the large bulks of the market work. We're selling beneficiated fresh ash. We're selling regular ash that isn't beneficiated and then harvested and very, very beneficiated ash. All of those ashes are being used to replace concrete, cement in concrete. Equally, a large part of the markets have big logistical swings to where the difference between fresh ash and beneficiated ash is drowned out by the logistics of getting the ash to the market. And so the uniqueness of the Carolina market just doesn't carry out to the other parts of the market that way at all. Generally, almost every market, the SCMs are sold out. There's certainly an economic overlay, but one of my old adages is like a third of the market is regulatory. There's a lot of fly ashes and other SCMs being used to deal with real engineering issues, and so then the price is less important to the process than the engineering issue. But a good 2/3 of the market is an economic proposition. But as the markets have grown here and the supply has shrunk so dramatically, and further shrinking is coming of the fresh ash, the dynamic where the fresh ash goes first and we put in the dome and all just isn't really applicable to incredible swaths of the market, 90+%. And that's the reality I see everywhere. And it is a 1-to-1 replacement for cement, largely in most markets.
Thank you. Eric?
Yeah, this is Eric Cheney from PCA. Are you asking for Portland Cement product-specific EPDs as your baseline emission factor? And I ask this because recently reviewed what's currently in the EC3 database, and it looks like there's about 23 or 24 plants, domestic plants that are represented there, which would give you about 20 to 30% of domestic production being represented by a product-specific EPD, and 70 to 80% that isn't. So it may be more useful to look at the US industry-wide EPD. And there is some imported production that's represented by North American PCR covered PPDs as well. It's mostly coming from Canada. Very little for products that are imported from Europe or Asia. So that would be a strange way to disqualify somebody from being able to use their novel SEM just because there wasn't a product specific Portland cement EPD available for what it's being used to replace. And the other thing is, when the SEM is replaced, you don't know which plants Portland cement it's replacing. It could go to somebody that's getting their cement from more than one cement plant too. So I think this is going to be problematic if you're demanding product specific cement EPDs for what it's replacing.
I think
Thanks. Go
go
ahead.
ahead. I know I'm kind of cutting in line here, but I guess just a quick point of clarification. So the intent is that if you are able to use product specific, definitely use that. But so for number 2 here that Mackenzie has on it, if those data aren't available, which we expect they will not be available for most of the time, using the PCA's kind of general EPD would be the backup. So hopefully the lack of specific data won't be a problem.
Yeah, I think that's a big one. That's a question we have for the group. Would there even ever be a situation where facility specific data would be publicly available or shared with an SEM producer as a part of their project? It's a question for the group. I from my experience with other industries, I don't think so, but a question definitely for the group of how likely that would be, how feasible, practical it would be for someone to set up a project and their project emissions to be their SCM and to create their baseline quantification, access, facility specific Portland cement data, and know to Eric's point that it's that facility that it's displacing at the same time. So a question. Jamie?
I'm just looking here at transportation emissions for PC production during the look back period. And I take it the look back period, and I think it was one of the questions in the box, is the actual project period for which you are now stating you're actually collecting data, et cetera, and you're doing the verification period over. Obviously, transport emissions for Portland cement, if this SEM is actually being used as in a blended cement, well, that would be 0 because it'd be at the cement plant. But now I'm looking at that and I'm saying, okay, we just had this conversation about SSR 10 transportation, and meanwhile here it is in the baseline, and hence I think then it also needs to be in the project level, correct? Am I missing something? And that SSR 10 is actually in.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think the background thought on that is that it would be apples to apples to compare transportation emissions for the baseline Portland cement product and the project SCM product. But then once those two things become a cement material, the transportation of that after that fact would not be. But I see your point in terms of the life cycle and the chain of custody to the end use as well.
So this is transport for like the mining materials is not SSR 10.
No, I think if I'm not taking the words out of your mouth, Jamie, I think what he's saying is if we are considering transportation of the mining material of the mined materials, up front, why, like at the front of the supply chain, why is the transportation of the end product not included as well?
Okay. Okay.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jamie, but that's what I heard.
You've got it exactly right.
thoughts, comments on, I mean, I think we're already chatting about it a bit in terms of the displacement at a 1-to-1 ratio and the questions around that. Does the group generally agree with the use of Portland cement as the baseline, as the product that's being displaced, whether it's, based on these assumptions or not? Obviously right now, I think in the market, there's predominantly Portland cement, but there is some traditional fresh fly ash cement, some slag cement, limestone cement I know came up. I don't think Christina's on. I know Lauren from NRDC is on, but that question came up before of, where does limestone cement play in this as well? And I could be naive in terms of the emission profiles, but I see Matthew, you've got your hand up, so I'll pause my rant and turn over to you.
Oh no, you can continue. I was going to address limestone cement. Yeah, my comment would be that limestone cement is increasingly taking a large market share.
Okay.
And what we've seen is it's very regional, but I don't have specific data on this, so don't take my numbers too seriously. But I've heard 25% of the cement market is PLC, and I know that's driven by some areas more so than others. I guess I want to pose a question to everybody from the cement industry who is in the group on is there data published on the market shares of PLCs versus traditional Portland cement? Because here's what I'm thinking. We have brought up that there are potential difficulties with verifying the source of cement and its emissions, right? I do like this, this hierarchy of using plant specific data, then using, industry EPDs and regional data. So if it's the case that we can't verify that, it's possible that we could assume that we're replacing cement at a high level. And then as far as the cement that is replaced, and I'm going to asterisk that because I don't think we can fully assume it, but for what portion of cement that we can assume we're replacing, that we can assume that we're replacing it proportional to the market availability of Portland cement versus Portland limestone cement. So Portland limestone cement, again, I would want a source on this, a data source, and I'm going to put that out to everybody from the cement industry on the call, about 10% emissions reduction from cement. So if you're replacing, for whatever portion of Portland limestone you're replacing, you are only getting about 90% of the avoided emissions that you're getting from replacing the same amount of, type 1 Portland, ordinary Portland cement. So there's a difference in their emissions.
That like an 8% reduction just based on our industry-wide EPDs. For practical reasons, you can't really get all the way up to 15% limestone. So most trucks are in the 10 to 13% range.
So you're saying that by your EPDs, you're seeing a 10 to 13% practical reduction?
No, about an 8%.
8%.
Because
okay, I get you.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, do you know if there's data published out there, Eric, on the market share of type 1L versus type 1?
So our ability to collect data has been outstripped by its growth in the past year. With the last that I saw from the U.S. Geological Survey was somewhere on the order of about 30 to 35% of blended cements. However, it seems that not everybody responding to their monthly surveys is aware that type 1L cement is a blended cement. So it might be an underestimate. It could be higher, but I think they're redesigning the survey, so we should see some more accurate information as the 2023 numbers come in. But in terms of PCA's direct survey to our members, that's limited to what our members report, not all of North American production. And it just takes time to get that out. So I haven't seen final 2022 numbers yet.
Matthew, I thought you told us the reports were perfect. Come on.
All right, James, what was your question?
I said, I thought you said the reports were perfect. We were counting on every report being absolutely perfect. I counted. Come on. I think with the PCA reports, they're incredible. There's hardly an industry in the country that has better data than the cement data because of what the government requires to be reported. So we're in a transition, but you give it 18 months or 2 years, and you'll have an incredibly accurate report. It's just we're going through a transition. So the quantity of Portland cement, whether it's blended or not, is incredibly accurately reported every month. It's incredible. It's got a lag. It's got like a 3-month lag. And but it is an incredible piece of information, and it's kept at an incredible detail down to the county in every state. So it is a report I think you can rely on, and I think you'll get to that number quick, even if it is in flux right now.
Yeah, my point about PCA's numbers is that our members are somewhere around 60 to 65% of shipments in the U.S. Not we don't have every cement producer in the U.S. as a member, so our survey is different than the U.S. Geological surveys.
No, I understand, but the geological data from the government does count them all, and so the data is there. It's available. It's public.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, to be entirely fair, I mean, using the best available and most recent data source, when we're looking at this, is kind of the most that can be asked, right? If it's good enough for the EPD methodology, to use the most recent and best available data source.
Is the idea then, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but is the idea then to potentially use that information to construct like a market baseline?
I think it would be appropriate to construct the market baseline where the breakdown of cements on the market, and to make it round and easy, say 75-25. So that we've got 75% type 1 Portland cement and 25% type 1L Portland limestone cement. And then you can see the relative emissions of each. So then you can create an average of cement, and you can say when you replace cement broadly, this is what you're replacing. You're replacing the average, market baseline. Would it be entirely fair or perfect to the individual producer that's consuming that SCM? No, because they might be using 100%. But you see the double bind there, where if a concrete producer that's buying an innovative SCM is already forward thinking and looking to reduce their carbon emissions, they would probably already be trying to source Portland limestone cement, which means that when they replace cement with an innovative SCM, they're replacing a lower emission material. However, I think, like we said, there may be difficulties in gathering that information of exactly what type of cement they're replacing. So I think it would be fair to construct the market baseline and assume they're replacing the market average, right? And you create a weighted average of the emissions of the cement they're replacing based on the market share of type 1 and type 1L.
Interesting. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I see a couple of hands, so maybe I'll see what folks think. Danny.
Yeah, this is was maybe a question for the cement side guys. When you're doing the survey, if you're starting to track data on 1L cements, do you have a way of, or do you ask the question for the ready mix producers if they use the same level of SCMs at 1L as they did with PC? Straight PCA does not survey cement concrete producers. We survey cement producers. Okay. Is anyone tracking that? Whether there is a substitution when you go to 1L, if there's a substitution, reduction, or increase in the SCM that's used? That is a good question. Our promotion of type 1L cement has advocated for trying to use 1L cement as a 1-to-1 replacement, but it can't guarantee it. And in some cases, there are small tweaks to the mix designs that are needed just to account for water demand or some other issue. But that is certainly a question we would like to see answered. It's just that it can come in as snippets from individual producers, and then you just got anecdotal information. It's not really a comprehensive statistical survey. So that's something I'm trying to put some feelers out on, but I don't have that information directly.
Yeah, I mean, we're hearing the same anecdotal information. Is the reason I asked if you guys were trying to track it or not. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we don't have a good way to do that directly, but certainly, maybe larger ready mix producers that are using digital batch tickets have an easy way to analyze what they've done. They'd have to be forthcoming about what they're doing. And then maybe that's something that NRMCA could try to do a survey on.
Thanks. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, related to that topic, I mean, my understanding, the way it's happening is a cement producer is either producing one or the other, right? It's a transition. So if you look at like Holston's St. Genevieve plant, they were producing a type 1-2, and now they're producing a type 1L. You can't go batch to batch, day to day, and make one or the other. So the transition that's occurring is one of cement plants switching over, and as they look at their grinding capacities, they're going to make the choice when they can make the transition. So today we might be at 30%. I think the assumption is in 5 years we'll be at 80% or 90% of the market will be type 1L. So it's in flux. The second part of that, is that my observations have been right now it's a one-to-one replacement. That again, cement supplier or concrete suppliers typically have 2 silos. They're now filling it with 1L in markets that 1L is the dominant material, and they're still batching out their concrete very similar until they do take the time to optimize their mixes. The truth is that with certain SCMs, you can actually go higher SCM content with the 1Ls because of the illuminate content of the SCM plays very nicely with the limestone. So I think these numbers will materialize, but I think the thing to realize right now is that we're in flux. But the reality is at least from the Portland Cement Association's perspective, and Eric, you can comment on that, is that the market will be almost entirely 1L within a fairly short period of time.
Helpful, thanks.
I
Matthew?
can only say that that's individual producers' decisions to make that switch. It's not an industry-wide decision.
And I did want to, for those of you who are unaware, what happens when you introduce 1L, it is counterintuitive, but it reduces your productivity, right? So for cement producers, they've optimized their grinding capacity to their clinkering capacity. And now when we introduce 1L, it actually has to be ground finer, and they lose production capacity. And so very few plants were designed with sufficient grinding capacity to make the same production requirement, same production levels with the transition to 1L. So what's going to happen is that grinding capacity is going to have to get added. And that's kind of what's slowing the process. Same time, I want everyone to understand that the transition to 1L has not been perfectly smooth. We are still working hard with certain segments of the industry that feel they want their 1-2 back, and they're going to fight to the death to get the 1-2 back. So that's another battle.
Okay. It's interesting to hear the transition, and I'm quite more questions than answers are coming up in my mind of how we'll capture that properly in the baseline right now. But I appreciate all the information. Matthew?
Yeah, I just want to say anecdotally from concrete producers, I've heard the same thing, that they're you know, they're encountering design issues with type 1L that I don't think is an issue inherent to the quality of type 1L, but is more so adjusting to you know, adjusting to new designs. And so the larger producers that have the capacity are hanging on to type 1 too, in markets where the transition isn't complete, and are using both. I've heard many producers say that they can't produce strengths above about 6,000 psi using type 1L, and that is not, again, I've also heard many that do, and I think they use a number of admixtures, you know, or optimize their designs to achieve it, right? But some producers are having trouble actually realizing a 1-to-1 replacement, and so where they have the capacity, they're keeping both on hand.
Thanks. David?
Yeah, I was just going to echo both what Tom and Eric mentioned regarding just the phase in, and it is an individual producer and an individual facility process, depending on, you know, finish grinding capacity and other factors. But I'll just echo that it is something that the producer industry is moving toward, and just to kind of support that, you know, within a matter of years, a short number of years, you know, the goal is that a good bit of the marketplace will be transitioned over to PLC, but it'll be specific to facilities. So each facility will have, you know, variations of percentages as well. So.
Okay. That's helpful. Like I said, I'm not sure how we will best capture this in the baseline. I think that will be something we'll have to review more internally and think about, potentially if we are looking at including that transition to limestone. I see a couple of hands up, I guess, to hopefully conclude this slide and maybe offer a short break before going into the rest of the quantification. Appreciate any thoughts or comments, I guess, from the cement industry folks on the availability of like facility-based data. I don't think that's publicly available. Would there be situations where that would be shared with, you know, a SCM producer to create their baseline? How would that work? Would there be obviously a confidentiality needs? And then I guess the emission factors, it sounds like there are those EPDs or the PCAs, you know, nationwide estimates on those for, I guess, both Portland cement and Portland limestone cement. So we could use those unless I'm mistaken. Tom, did you have your hand up or was that from before?
That's me being kind of lazy and not.
No, that's my job. No problem. Laura.
Yeah, you were asking about facility specific
yes,
data.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure. Thanks.
Our product specific EPDs that come out of cement plants are facility specific because, you know, it's not just type 1L cement produced across all of, say, Heidelberg's portfolio. It's type 1L cement produced at a particular plant, or type 1 cement produced at a particular plant, because there are differences in the fuel mix and the energy source at these plants that affect their overall greenhouse gas emissions. Now, whether they're going to break it out as you're showing on this slide, that is harder to say. But I don't see how an SCM producer can predetermine, you know, whose cement their product is going to be combined with. I think their goal should be that it's something you could use with anybody's cement. So for that reason, I mean, trying to use industry-wide average values can just really simplify all of this.
Yeah. Lauren.
Thanks, Mackenzie. This shouldn't, we can probably still have a break after this comment, but I just want to highlight that this will be updated periodically, the methodology, right? So I would suggest we use what we can get today, given data available today, and then 5 years from now, when the reserve wants to put out a version 2.0, there'll be hopefully better data as well. So just highlighting that we don't need to we should get it correct to the extent we can, but if there's some assumption of future significant changes, those will be reflected later.
Yeah, good point. I was thinking that as well, with how to potentially have a type 1L mix baseline at what point, and that we can also update as needed, so it may change over time. Okay, I guess based on that comment from Eric, and I appreciate, Lauren, your thoughts on this as you drafted it with the historical plant specific data, but is there even a need to have that option then, option number 1 of the historical plant specific data? I mean, we can have it there as an option, but is it going to be 9 times or 10 times out of 10 that people that are doing projects don't use that because it's not really available to the granularity that's in this equation, and B, to Eric's point, the SEM producer, if owner of the credits, wouldn't really know what facility cement they're replacing in the market, would they? So should we hang our hat more on these like industry-wide average values to provide the emission factors? And is that the most readily available, accurate data in the market right now? Thoughts on that? Lauren, I don't know if you have any, from your perspective of why that was included.
I think we just like to include the optionality to have the best available data. For example, there might be a situation where a cement, like an OPC production facility, purchases a like an SCM producer, and then they're kind of doing both on site, so they would have the data. But I do think like the vast majority of time, number 2 would be used.
Okay. Craig, go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly add to Lauren's point. I think we should leave it in, recognizing that perhaps it is highly unlikely it will be used. But I just think optically, as a broader group of stakeholders look at this protocol, they're going to want to see this granularity. They may not appreciate all the reasons why it's going to be difficult to use plant-specific data, but as long as we have it in there, if it happens to be available, maybe things change in the future, who knows? At least we've got it in there. But this is intended to be as noted, a hierarchical approach. So I would suggest we just leave it in, recognize that it may not be kept very often, but so what?
Makes sense. Okay, so we'll leave it as is, and then with the assumption that the vast majority will likely use the EPDs or the industry-wide data, and we can ensure that that section has all the information needed, just in the differences between like the PCA reports and the product-specific EPDs, and just make sure that's clear. And then it sounds like the other item to think about is potentially how the baseline is looked at in terms of product type between Portland cement and Portland limestone cement, taking into consideration both that transition over time as well as the opportunity to update the protocol over time. So I think that gives us sort of our action items from here. I'm just making some notes, and then the EPD section we'll review. Any other thoughts or comments on the overall baseline emission factor equation before we maybe take a short break and dive into the rest of the quantification? Okay, I don't see any hands, so maybe we'll take about 10 minutes or so, come back at why don't we say we'll come back at 5 minutes to the next hour, so a little more than 10 minutes, if that works for everyone. It'd be 10:55 a.m. my time Pacific, but what that is for everyone else. Thanks, see you in a few minutes. Okay, so we're about 5 minutes to the hour, so I'll go ahead and get started, assuming most people are back at their desks. I think we have we have an hour left. I think if we can get through most of the quantification and hopefully discuss MRV as well, that would be great. The next part of the baseline emissions is the idea that we are proposing adding in a part of the calculation that would provide the opportunity for project developers to generate credits for captured or removed CO2, either by injecting it into the product or as a part of the product itself, like potentially biochar, other sequestered products, products that have sequestered carbon. So we're proposing it simply as an addition into the baseline, and that the CO2 captured would be the amount of cement multiplied by its difference in carbon content, which could be done through analysis, different lab analyses, and then multiplied by 44/12, which is simply the conversion to CO2 from carbon. I'll pause here if there's any questions or thoughts. I think this is a broader question as to how we best include it within the GHG boundary, but this is the proposal to date of how we would potentially quantify that amount of CO2 that's captured. Seth, not to put you on the spot, I don't know if you wanted to add anything from your perspective and experience with these types of methodologies before opening it up for questions.
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of different ways to calculate or consider the CO2 that is actively injected into cement or concrete materials. VM43 has both the measuring CO2 that goes through a flow meter and is injected in. The issue with that is that, of course, some of the CO2 is likely to escape. But in terms of quantifying the CO2 that actually gets mineralized, doing sampling of baseline materials and post-carbonation materials is a sort of a way to avoid that, where you're basically just measuring the amount that is actually mineralized through the lab testing. So, I mean, I think this sort of summarizes it pretty clearly, and nothing more to add on that.
Thanks, Seth. Appreciate it. Tom?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the problem though, right? Is measuring the mineralized CO2 is not trivial. And I don't think there's a standard method. And like right now, the only people that seem to be saying they can do it is NIST. So that is one of the big problems, I think, for CO2 mineralization in concrete, is actually being able to have a usable assessment tool to determine that level of mineralization, especially going from liquid to gas, right? I think we all appreciate the volume change there is immense. So in some of the systems, 99% of the CO2 is definitely leaving the system.
Yeah, I mean, I having spoken to a number of people in the industry, there's a range of testings, TGA, carbon analyzers, acid digest. I'm not an expert in this area, but seems like the ecosystem is evolving quickly in terms of being able to come up with a range of tests that measure carbonation levels pre and post.
Lauren?
So just for my ignorance here, what exactly is being tested? Is it the concrete or the cement?
So I think it would be whatever is mineralized, whatever material is having carbon injected into it, or carbon dioxide. So if it's an additive, it would be the additive pre and post. If it's cement, it would be cement pre and post, or concrete pre and post. So like, for example, Carbon Cure, they inject the CO2 into the ready mix directly. And so you would take a sample of the ready mix before and after and measure the difference.
And we're actually doing that right now on the Min Road project. So we have two controls, with and without carbon cure. And those are they had to go to NIST. When you get to concrete, it gets so diffuse, and so the quantities are so minuscule that it's really difficult. Now, if you're looking at an additive, that would be easy. Could be done using traditional techniques. If you're looking at something of that type, but once you inject it into concrete, the volume of it is so small that it just becomes lost.
So would this change our boundary? Quantification boundary?
Yeah, potentially. I think the SSR 10 and 11 are still up for debate of if they'd be included or not. I guess I would think that if it was done at concrete and SSR 11, when the cement is blended was included, then it would be the same change. But I mean, to answer your question, yes, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'll leave it at that for now. I just wanted to flag that was a change in this version of the draft protocol. Oh, sorry, Kayla.
Yeah, I did just have a hopefully a quick question for folks, just so I can better understand this. Does mineralization impact the carbonation over time? So if we are accounting for CO2 that's included, in the cement, would that CO2 already been sucked up over the lifetime of concrete? So are we potentially over-crediting here if we do include this in the baseline?
And I raised my hand to answer, and I think the answer to your question is yes. As would, basically, within concrete, the two phases that are going to predominantly carbonate are going to be calcium hydroxide, and then even the calcium silicate hydrate will carbonate in time. Things that we would do to convert calcium hydroxide to calcium carbonate through the addition of CO2 would then use that up, would not be available for further carbonation later on.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Seth. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say that I think that there is, of course, carbonation that continues throughout the life of, let's say, the concrete, but it's really very much at the surface of the material. I mean, the CO2 can't really penetrate inside. So if you're at the point of production of the product, if you're mixing CO2 into a larger volume of material, that I think most of that probably would not increase in carbonation over time, because not much of that would be, I guess it really kind of depends on the surface area of the end use, but it wouldn't really penetrate more inside. And again, this is not my area of expertise, but from my talking to people in the industry, that the carbonation of product over the lifetime doesn't really penetrate much into the material.
Thanks, Seth. Go ahead, Tom.
Nope, I did it again.
No problem. Jamie?
Sorry, I was on mute there. I think this is fine the way it is. I'm a little concerned that there is no taking into consideration possible fugitive emissions in the process of mineralization. So to me, I'm saying, if there's CO2 actually released, i.e. if it's not all captured or mineralized, are we accounting for that? And being a little bit of an LCA purist, the units here are not tons CO2 equivalent, they're just tons CO2.
Yeah, good catch. Thanks. Yeah, maybe we could look at potentially including
I'm thinking here of a
different
correction
loss.
factor,
Yeah.
I mean, I think the idea of mineralization, the lab testing taking into account only the amount that is actually locked into the material, and everything else that's lost before that, in the injection equipment and the transportation stuff is, not counted in that, of course. And if the assumption is that CO2 would have been vented to the atmosphere anyway, that I think I think it kind of covers you, but yeah, happy to discuss further.
Okay.
I do think that, you know, this is a very important thing to think about, because when we talk about this mineralization, it's a broad area, right? And you have this idea of into the cement, and this is very demonstratable. You work within a closed system, right? So you put materials within a carbon dioxide rich environment. You know how much CO2 is going out. You're mineralizing. And you should not be releasing additional CO2 to the atmosphere. So if you're in a closed system and you're doing something like a cement or a cement additive, I think it's pretty clear that you can track all of these things. I think the more difficult technologies are those that are open to the air, in which, you know, again, carbon cure, where you're injecting 12 ounces or 8 to 12 ounces of liquid CO2 into the back of a concrete truck per cubic yard of concrete. I mean, Carbon Cure knows how much they're losing, more or less, and they're losing a lot, right? Because the volume of the concrete is not increasing, yet you're putting 5 to 7 cubic feet of gas into the concrete per 27 cubic feet of concrete. So I think that in those cases, the amount of CO2 loss to the atmosphere is quite significant, and in truth, a lot more is going into the atmosphere than is being mineralized. So I think that needs to be accounted for. So if we're only focusing on the powders, I think that's where the focus, and keep it on these additives, cement additives and cement. I think that's a great way to go. But I think if we start getting into the concrete side of it, it's going to get a little messier.
Okay. Lauren?
I was just scrolling through the methodology, so I'm assuming it's covered somewhere, but we would be covering the emissions associated with energy use to capture the CO2 and compress it potentially, depending on how this all ends up, if we're assuming a venting baseline. Is that accurate?
Yeah, right now I don't think we have it included, but I think to your point, it probably should be if we're looking at that. I don't know, Seth, if you have comments from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think of this as a little bit like another SCM, where you're accounting for the emissions associated with capturing, compressing, processing. You know, it's like you're mining CO2. Think of it that way. So I think that the formulas are, and I think maybe some of the edits capture this, just saying yes, you know, all of the materials associated with processing SCM and CO2, right, should be considered.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
We could make that clearer, though I probably didn't write it well in the methodology right now, just that, yeah, within that CO2 section that is included and expected. Yeah. For the sake of time, or Jamie, was that a new hand, or was that your hand from your last comment?
Apologies. Yep.
All good. Just checking. Okay. So for the sake of time, I think I'll move on. Please feel free to make comments on that section on the CO2 additions to the quantification, but I'll make these considerations as well and edits. And there's some helpful comments in the chat as well around Carbon Star technical specifications as well for some guidance there. So we'll do some more review internally and then edit that section for your comment. I will go through this fairly quickly for your comments. You know, we've talked about that, you know, the plant specific data approach for baseline emissions from Portland cement is probably not going to be the most commonly used, but is the, you know, best form of data that we could expect. So I'll go through these fairly quickly. Please put your hand up if you have any comments that you think need to be discussed within the group format. Of course, you can make edits to these as well in the draft protocol. The first is mining emissions. Obviously, we're looking to calculate the mining emissions, and this would be done through grid electricity consumption, emission factors for that grid electricity based on the US EPA, grid emission public factor. Comments on that is the emission factor for electricity usage, and then fuel consumption and emission factors for fuel consumed, also according to the EPA. So, you know, amount of fuel, amount of electricity, oh, sorry, with its emission factors to calculate mining emissions. I'll keep going through these unless I see hands raised. I can also go back, but figure it would be appreciated if you had any comments on these emission factors, if you think that they're the most accurate to be used in this example. Next is the plant-specific data approach, the baseline emissions. So this would simply be the production emissions is what we're calculating, and then energy emissions and calcination emissions for the look back period. I can continue on for the energy emissions. That would be very similar to what was looked at for the mining emissions, where you would have your electricity used, your fossil fuel consumption used, or I guess I should say fuel consumption, fossil fuel. And then you would have your emission factors from the EPA for both the e-grid and the fuel consumption. I have a comment in the chat that says throughout the calculations, how will Rex and other such tools be treated? I'm not familiar with Rex as a tool. Maybe I'm misunderstanding that. I don't know if anyone else in the work group is aware of Rex, REC. Yeah, Lauren.
Yeah, typically Rex wouldn't be considered in this. It would only be if, like, for example, direct renewables were connected. At least that's what I've seen in other like carbon programs. I think it's probably a CARB standard that you can't purchase Rex to change this.
Okay. Thanks. So similar there with the emission factors. The clinker, the calcination would be determined with the clinker to cement ratio and the emission factor for clinker produced for that look back, and that would be based on national emission data. Any comments, questions thus far in the facility specific approach and calculations? Transport emissions, same thing. So this would be transport of the mined product, distance traveled, and the emission factor as well. So I guess our ask of you as a work group is to, when you're reviewing the draft protocol in written form, if you do have any comments or questions, considerations that we should take into account for the different emission factors that are being considered when calculating this at a facility basis. Any other thoughts, comments before I jump to project emissions? Yeah, Miguel.
Going back to the previous equation, the distance traveled to the PC production, what happens if there's a lot of suppliers? The distance, well, I guess it's gonna be an equation for each of the different suppliers, right? Or maybe another way to streamline this could be, because I don't know how difficult it will be to track that, to use the longest distance from the supplier that is the furthest, maybe to calculate this and to be conservative about, well, no, sorry, this is for my bad. I think this is for baseline calculations, so probably would be the shortest distance.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure, right. Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. I'm not sure if the cement producers have any comments on this from where they're, sourcing their mined raw materials and the distance traveled for that, if it's, a typical location or if it's from multiple suppliers, but that's a good point, Miguel, of how we could go about it conservatively if there's multiple.
Yeah, because my concern specifically will be like maybe it will be very cumbersome if there's a lot of suppliers. Then it will be like yeah, very hard to track that. And so yeah, probably just like yeah, take conservative parameters to streamline. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, now that you're saying that, I guess it could be the same for mining as well. Like I'm not sure if all of the raw materials for Portland cement are mined and transported from the same locations or not. So if it's multiple different sites or something, we could look at a way to streamline.
Sure.
Sure. Thanks. Project emissions, so this would be the emissions associated with SCM or ACM manufacturing and the product that would be displacing the Portland cement. So the things being considered here are the mining emissions of the raw materials, transportation of those materials, the actual SCM or ACM production. Oh, I've got that double. Mining and production for production and transportation of additives. And then as well, we've added the end of life waste emissions as well. So the first is mining emissions for that, very similar to the baseline and how it's being proposed. So, you know, you would have your grid electricity consumption, fuel consumption, and then the emission factors, which would determine your mining emissions. I'll pause here probably for some thoughts from the group on this slide, but for production of the actual SCM or ACM product, it is similar. It's, you know, electricity and fuel used for the production of the product, and then the emission factors as well. But maybe I'll pause. I don't know from the SCM producers that, you know, are these equations easily calculated? Is it reflective of the production cycles? Is there anything to add? Tom?
Well, this is kind of a hard point maybe, but I'm just wondering, I mean, why aren't we just requiring an EPD?
For the
And what I'm
baseline?
getting at is you have a product category rule with peer review, you know, that was involved through a rigorous process. You have independent people doing the environmental assessment, third-party verification. And are we looking for suppliers to self-report on these things?
In terms of like suppliers of the
Well,
mined products, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, you said grid electricity consumption
Yeah.
for SC. Who's reporting that number? Who's doing this calc?
So I think for the baseline emissions, that's where it's, so right now we're proposing that the SCM or ACM producer would be the owner of the project or the credits by default unless transferred. So I mean, assumingly that would mean that those producers are the ones doing these calculations with their project developer who not. So it would likely be more difficult for that SCM producer to have access to all of the electricity and fuel consumption for the baseline scenario, right, of Portland cement, because they're likely not the ones making the Portland cement. To Lauren's point, it could be an example in the future where it's a SCM company that's tied in with a cement facility and therefore they have all of the data. But if it's two different entities, then that baseline scenario information wouldn't be accessible versus this project emission for like manufacturing the SCM. I guess we're assuming, or that's what's being proposed, is that say for mining emissions, that SCM producer would have access to the data of how much electricity and fuel was used to say harvest fly ash.
I guess it's just a you know, fox watching the hen house kind of thing. I don't know why. I'm just throwing it out there. It's pretty far along, but I think I would have just used, like Eric said, you know, regional or national numbers for the cement based on EPDs, which are already out, and then require the producers to have an environmental product declaration generated according to a process. you know, the standard process. And the problem is that there are some SCMs that might not go through any mining at all, right? They may be taking municipal garbage and reacting it with seawater and coming up with an SCM and through a chemical process. So I just am getting a little nervous about self-reporting for seeking of credits, whereas we have a process already being established to use environmental product declarations. But I'm just throwing it out there.
No, that's what this is for. So I appreciate your comments. I think what our idea is that the verification would lie at this project emission. That's another question for the group, right? Is like we have, obviously verification and we have site visits as well. So theoretically we could have verification take place or would take place at the SCM facility that would be doing quote unquote the self-reporting, and then that would be verified and confirmed via site visit. Did someone else have their hand up that I missed? Lauren? Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah, I was just debating whether or not it was useful to chime in here or not, since I think you kind of covered it, Mackenzie. So when we designed this, we've written a couple other protocols where we use site measured data, and our experience has been it's been pretty accurate, and the verification process should be just as rigorous as the EPDs. It's just sort of the carbon offset equivalent of the process. So we lean towards having it in alignment with what the carbon offset standards are, versus the EPDs, which I know don't get updated every single year. This would require like more timely data perhaps, but EPDs might be simpler. I don't think we're against that. It would be not quite as industry standard in the offset world.
Can it at least be an independent does the assessment? And Jamie, you know a lot more about this than I do. I'll just take a line from a guy I work with a lot. I'm just an old country boy. What do I know? But Jamie, what is your feeling? I mean, it just seems like self-reporting is always filled with the potential for deception or error.
I agree with you, Tom. There's always the possibility for error. I see this as possible two parallel approaches where, yes, first you create that EPD according to the product category rules, and instead of it lasting 5 years, maybe it's an annual thing that you end up having to do. But if you're using or been in that EPD environment, it's something that you can easily update on an annual basis. Now, to what extent are you going to make that available into the public world? That may or may not be the case depending on the product category rules and your EPD program operator. But if somebody else is doing the calculations and it is going out for third-party review, I think an EPD is a way to go. Mind you, it may end up being an annual EPD to be in line with the project here. At the same time, I can do all this on a spreadsheet, and somebody from CAR can come over and have a look over my shoulder and make sure I'm doing it right. So I think there's a couple ways you can do this, but I like the idea of using EPDs because they're probably going to be more comparable to what you're comparing to, i.e. EPDs from the cement environment.
And a matter of fact, I'll even take one more step at this. If you're doing a project for a GSA or the state of Colorado, or potentially in the future DOTs, you're going to have an EPD. This information provided to a ready mix producer would not be sufficient for them to generate an EPD with that product. I mean, they're going to need to do EPDs in order to fit within the entire system that we're moving to.
I think maybe Mackenzie or Craig can chime in about the rigor of the verification process, and how it might compare to EPD. I don't really have a strong feeling either way, because it's third party verified. There's lots of documentation underlying this. It's not just providing it in a spreadsheet. You also need to show where all these data came from and kind of the paper trail, but I'll leave it to Car to talk about that.
Yeah.
Well, I think
Oh, go ahead.
this is Jamie again. What I'm thinking going forward here is that this is not carbon offset world and the LCA world are two different places. And LCA and EPDs are coming to the fore. And now we're trying to entrench LCA and EPDs in the carbon offset world. And I'm not sure that they both align. And it's something new for the carbon offset world to actually start looking at EPDs and those types of emission factors that are used in their creation, and to what extent they are, cradle to grave or cradle to gate, what have you. So there seems to be loggerheads here in terms of how one would do this. And I think, the world is moving towards a more evidence-based LCA world, and carbon offsets in some respects, I think, needs to still catch up. That's just a personal observation.
Yeah, Jamie, that's really helpful. I was going to say, I'm honestly not familiar with the details of how a lot of these EPDs get constructed. So I'm not here to refute that they may not be a good alternative. I will simply say that what's on the screen right now is a very typical analytical approach across greenhouse gas accounting for frankly, determining the bottom line impact. Now, whether an EPD might be a replacement for that, I think we're going to have to take a closer look at that.
Okay, thanks, Craig. Thanks, everyone. I think that's probably a fair conclusion that we, at the reserve, this is, like Craig said, a typical, analytical approach to assessing the emissions, but more broadly to your points, Jamie, how those EPDs and LCAs interface with this, or could be used as alternatives. We'll put it on our to-do list to review that and see how it's best used.
Yeah, Mackenzie, just one other thing, like I've noticed in some parts of the protocol, you're leaving off things like methane and dinitrogen oxide, but those are things that are actually captured in an LCA and EPD. And again, I want to make sure that this is an apples to apples protocol, right? So if you're going to rely on EPD information for the baseline, then it better be as similar and as robust methodology for coming up with your numbers here.
Thanks, that's helpful. I had flagged that on the previous slide that we didn't get to, since a lot of the emissions that are being looked at, as you saw, are CO2 or CO2 equivalents, or just CO2, like you had noted previously. But yes, that's helpful to know that other emissions are included in the EPD for comparison purposes. Thanks. We'll review that part too.
One other comment, not all products are going to have PCR, the product category rule that allows them to create an EPD. So this quant would allow those products to participate before that PCR exists.
Fair point. Yeah, it sounds like maybe we just want to align the methodologies as best we can with the EPD if that's being used for the baseline, and then offer EPDs maybe as another alternative. That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So similarly for transportation, I mean, nothing new. I'm kind of showing you the same equations for different aspects. So maybe I'll take us to I'll take us, sorry, to the end of life waste emissions. This was an addition that we made to better align with the EPDs. I'll lean on Lauren to comment further as needed, but it's our understanding that the end of life waste emissions are generally included. So we added this as an included section of the protocol and therefore the quantification. So this equation is, end of life waste emissions. It's the quantity of waste generated by an emission factor. And projects shall use the emission factor appropriate to the disposal method. Anything you wanted to add, Lauren or Caleb, before opening it up? I don't know if there's any questions or comments with this. Again, we can at the reserve double check it aligns with the EPDs as well.
Yeah, we added this in to make sure so it would be aligned with the EPD. And I guess just to keep things crystal clear, it's the end of life emissions for waste during the production. It's not end of life emissions for the product itself. That's
Right.
outside the boundary. So it's the waste, because just assuming there might be different types of waste produced at different facilities.
Thanks. So again, your comments there. Oh, Jimmy.
I have a question, I guess, related to the mining and the end of life. There are projects that there's already a requirement that the material be dug up. It's in a CCR unit that needs to be closed by removal. And as part of that process, whatever's not beneficially used is going to a disposal site that's already part of that process. So my question is, and it's really more for context, when you have a project that's like that, and this may be project by, project specific, would those mining emissions and the end of life waste emissions be attributed to the requirement for closure by removal as opposed to put on this project itself? Since the material is already being dug up anyway, and the project itself to produce the SCMs is avoiding the end of life waste being redisposed, so to speak, in a lined landfill. Do you follow?
Yeah, I follow the question. I'm trying to think. I think it is project specific, as you mentioned, Jimmy. I think that would be a unique case where there is already some sort of mandate, like you're saying, for closure, that the raw materials for the SCM are already being mined and transport end of life waste. So if you're taking a segment of those and making a usable product out of it, do you need to consider that? I don't know, maybe I'll turn to Craig if that's okay. I'm trying to, I think we'd still want the emissions to get that raw material, since it's going to be compared to a baseline, which is more intensive, and then generate credit. So I think if those mining emissions and end of life waste emissions were removed, you'd be sort of potentially getting credits for that versus having that within the, compared to the baseline. Because the real incentive here is that you are creating an SCM product to displace clinker, not that you're, maybe it's a bridge too far that you're using the incentive to, maybe I'm speaking in circles, but it's not for that particular action, it's for the action of using that product then to make and displace. So it may be arbitrarily low then and over credit, but I say, Lauren, you have thoughts on that?
Well, also as a follow-up, one of the reasons
Please.
question as a case in point is, would it, as an example, if it were an EPD as opposed to this type of calculation, how would the EPD be calculated? Would there be any differences? Would there be one or another? Would one take it into account and the other not? That's really the thing. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, we'll at least want to make sure we align, if not anything more. Thank you.
And we did try to align, and if it wasn't perfect, I appreciate any of that feedback, but the intention was for it to be aligned between the baseline and the project. But anyway, for that specific instance, Jimmy, I think it would depend on exactly what the regulation requirements are, but if the regulation was that it needs to be pulled out of the landfill and then put into a better managed landfill, essentially, what I would recommend, and it would be up to CAR, but basically treat it as a waste product once it's been pulled out of landfill. So you kind of say that the beginning of this product's life as waste is after it's been removed from the badly managed or not appropriately managed landfill. And typically waste products, you don't consider the emissions prior to them becoming waste.
Okay. We'll take that into consideration and look at the EPD as well. Okay. Just taking notes here for us to look into that one. Okay. I'll move on to additives. I think this one might warrant a few minutes of discussion. Right now, it's being proposed that the project developer may exclude emissions for additives that make up 5% or less. So those would be like de minimis or not included, but if it's 5% or more of the final SCM product by weight, then the emissions need to be calculated. Secondary additives may be excluded from the calculation up to 5% again. So it's all based on this 5% threshold. Is that fair, correct? I think it's in alignment to Lauren and Kayla's comments with the EPDs. This is taken from that in terms of the emissions of additive products or the quantity of the additives by the emission factor, using emission factors from EPDs for these additives, or as another option at the bottom, published emission factors on regional data. Concerns, questions, comments, is 5% the right amount? Is that when it becomes significant? Why or why not? From an emission perspective, is this a fair way to assess and calculate the additives for those that are 5% or higher? Open the floor for discussion. Lauren, did you want to add any clarity as to where the 5% came from, if it was with EPD or?
I don't think it was EPD. I think it's a de minimis threshold that I've seen in other protocols, just for simplicity, since there might be a lot of little tiny bits of material that get added, that would be very difficult to get the full life cycle on.
Fair enough. Yeah, we do have that in some other protocols, so I can review. Not seeing any hands or questions, I'll continue on. Is there anything that the group wanted to revisit or discuss further from a quantification standpoint? My summary action items for that section are, of course, what we talked about for the baseline in terms of leaving the different hierarchy approaches, but considering potentially a market-based baseline with Portland cement and limestone cement, still a question mark, and we could keep it as it being changed over time as Portland cement becomes more prevalent, and replacing that as a baseline. It's one point I have. Also reviewing the EPDs, both product specific and industry-wide data for that section. I have some notes on the carbon dioxide as well, additives versus concrete, potentially using carbon star information, as well as ensuring that we note that the CO2, like the emissions to capture and compress and all of that, are assumed to be the same as SCMs, like basically mining an SCM. I have some notes on transportation and mining, if it's from multiple locations, how we can streamline that process. And then I have some highlighted notes here on just overarching alignment of the EPDs with our carbon offset quantifications, both from the perspectives of what's included and like what emissions are included. And then the last point I had here was the waste product question as well. Anything I missed on quantification, or did any other questions or thoughts come up when I was running through sort of my own summary? Okay, we have about 20 minutes left, so we'll try to get through some of the monitoring, reporting, and verification slides. Monitoring, and I'd say monitoring is pretty straightforward and is basically the requirements that would be needed to suffice the equations that we just went through. So there's probably not too many comments or thoughts on that, but I think reporting and verification may have more dialogue from the group. So MRV, as it's referred to, is the monitoring, reporting, and verification sections of our protocols. Quickly for your reference, monitoring is all the data collection and its frequency, record keeping plans, QA/QC provisions, the legal requirement test, data collection that kind of goes hand in hand with monitoring would be things that you saw in the equations like electricity and fuel consumption, distance traveled, quantity of SCMs produced, and adjustment factors for weight, adjustment factors for the products, or Portland cement emission factors. The reporting period, or what's required during reporting, we'll go into in more detail. Right now we're proposing that the period would be flexible based on the SCM production with a maximum of 12 months. And then the reporting documentation we'll get into on further slides. And then verification, kind of the final and most important step, is documentation and data review, data management, the question for a site visit. And then I also included a note here on sales receipts, sales volumes, batch receipts that folks have mentioned all around where can we draw the line that we have reasonable assurance that the SCM product did displace Portland cement, and how can that be verifiable and what kind of documents can be provided. So with that, I'll jump in. I don't know that we need to go through each of these in detail. Maybe I'll just put it as a plug for the group to review this within the draft draft protocol. I'm reading environmental regulations at the top here, mixing up my words. So this table is in the draft protocol. It outlines all the different parameters. So this is all the different, metrics that you saw within the equations that we went through. It gives a brief description of what that is, the unit that you'd be looking at. Again, correction to equivalence, that would just be tons of CO2 there. And then basically the requirement, like would it be calculated, measured, or would it be a operating record? So you have that through this column, and then it also gives you the measurement frequency. So every reporting period, monthly, those types of things. I think for time and best use of the group's attention, I'll leave that and ask you to go through it on your own. It's pretty tedious, but most of them are monthly measurements or calculations, or each reporting period there's a calculation based on what you saw, and this is basically where the data is coming from for that. Is there any questions on monitoring parameters that the group wanted to discuss, or do you agree that it's best served for our time for you to go through that in relation to the quantification equations? Okay, not hearing any, I'll take that as agreement and move on to reporting parameters. For project developers to list a project or submit a project, there's a few forms that we have here listed that would be required. I think I accidentally have that twice, my apologies. So it would be the submittal form, the signed attestation of title, the attestation voluntary implementation form. These are to suffice the ownership and legal requirement test. Also, the attestation of regulatory compliance form. The verification report and statement shouldn't be in this column here. My apologies, that's a typo. And then the documentation to issue credits, we would need at that point the verification report and the verification statement, as well as these documents as well. Are there any questions around reporting parameters? So this section also provides some information on what the project developer must retain. It's a period of 10 years after the information is generated, or 7 years after the last verification. So I believe this is almost equal, but we'll double check the years there, but it's like for a total of 10 years of time. The data that is being collected is inputs for the calculation. So all the monitoring parameters that you saw there for the project emission calculations and the reductions. Documentation of the quality and quantity of the SCM. So both the quantity that was produced, which goes into some of the equations, as well as the quality, which is covered with the new section on standards, notably the ASTM standards. Documentation on the quantity of additives. So we talked about additives. So, documentation that can be reviewed and verified as the percentage that went into the SCM by weight. And then copies of all solid waste, air, water, and land use permits, as well as any administrative or legal consent orders dating back 5 years, the project date, and for each subsequent year. And then an executed document of the documents that were already discussed as a part of ownership, regulatory compliance, legal requirement test. We have those documents here as well. So right now the reporting period is 12 months in length maximum, but is flexible based on the SCM production operations, except for the initial reporting period, which may cover up to 24 months, which is typical in alignment with our other protocols. There's some other information in terms of reporting gaps or sub-annual basis reports that you can review. But generally speaking, that's the outline for the reporting period. And then the verification period is up to 24 months of data. So no more than 2 years for the initial reporting period. And then subsequent verification periods may cover up to 2 reporting periods with a maximum of 24 months of data, 12 months of data per reporting period, except for the first reporting period, which is up to 24 months. And to meet the verification deadline, you must have the required verification documents submitted within 12 months of the end of verification period. So this is all in line with our other protocols at the reserve. So likely not too many comments or concerns, edits, but definitely in front of you for your review and thoughts if so. I think one of the last things that we wanted to gather information from the group on is a verification site visit. Typically with our other industrial protocols, there is a site visit at the facility where the emission reduction takes place. And this is, as Lauren mentioned, and Craig and others, this verification is to, check that the numbers and the self-reporting that took place in terms of calculating project emissions is accurate and correct by viewing, different equipment or other measurements that were collected and used in the quantification. This can be done both via review of data as well as a site visit. And we do have Miguel with Ruby Canyon as one of our verifiers to offer any thoughts or comments from that perspective on the work group. A site visit may occur during the initial verification and at least once every 2 reporting periods thereafter. There are some exceptions to that, like a new site visit could happen along with a verification of the previous reporting period, etc. So I think the question for the group in this instance is it's a bit more complicated than some of our other industrial protocols, since there's multiple facilities involved in the quantification. You know, there's the Portland cement facility that would be offering baseline information, or in lieu, we could look at the EPD, of course. You know, there's potentially the cement or concrete facility, right, that's purchasing these products and it's being transported there. So, you know, is there a need for a site visit? Yes or no? Likely, I think we're hearing yes from a, you know, a transparency perspective and quantification check. And then the question is, where does the site visit occur? And I think that would be likely at the SCM facility, as they'd be the ones potentially offering the most data in lieu of a PCR for their specific product. But it's an open discussion. We also have virtual site visits since the pandemic and that transition period. So that's an option for doing virtual at other locations or of other information or data. Tom.
Yeah, hi, Mackenzie. I'm a little maybe definitely in the dark on how this happens. So who's conducting the site visit? Are they contracted by Climate Action Reserve? Or are they employees of Climate Action Reserve? Or are they independent? You know, who are the verifiers?
Yeah, we have independent third-party verifiers of companies that are trained and listed as verifiers for different protocol project types. So Miguel with Ruby Canyon Environmental is on our work group as a verifier. That's one of the organizations or companies that does verification and site visits for some industrial protocols. So it's something that we oversee in a sense, but it's third-party and independent at a company level that we have a list of third-party verifiers.
Okay, that's good to know. And you know, following up, as far as I would definitely recommend that if a product has an EPD, you know, I mean, a cement company, I don't know what a site visit to a cement company would do beyond, you know, the fact that they've already, you know, they're monitored to death and they already generate EPDs, many of them. Same with, you know, natural ponds or some of the other facilities. I would suggest that maybe a different path is suggested. So, you know, this path might be a perfect path if they don't have an environmental product declaration.
That makes sense, and that's normally what we do. I think it goes to the comments of the EPDs and carbon offsets and how they align and overlap. So that's a fair comment, sure. Miguel?
Yeah, thanks, Mackenzie. Yeah, and Tom, I represent a company that provides the validation and verification services for these projects and some others. So we are accredited by the ISO 14064 Part 3. The new version, the 2019, is the transition that most of the verification bodies are currently going to. But yes, and my other comment or kind of like a question is about the site visit for the initial verification. So Mackenzie, what would happen in case that the validation and verification are done separately? I guess, could that be the case in which the initial verification, the site visit could not be conducted because that was already done in the validation?
Possibly. I'd have to double check on that one.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because due to the new guidance that, for example, the BCS provided, Berra, they told us that there's always gonna be a site visit in the first verification, regardless whether the validation also triggered a site visit and that was carried, like for example, a few months apart. So yeah, that was like their guidance. to us. And I think maybe if that's similar to the Climate Action Reserve, it would be glad to know that.
Yeah, I don't know that we have a similar like validation versus verification. I think it's just the verification period, but I'll check with Holly, one of our colleagues on that one and get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
So this is simply a list. There's 3 lists of what would be verified. And so I think this is something as well we can look to compare to the EPD, is to not duplicate efforts or misalign. We want to make sure we're in alignment with what we're using. So this is simply for your context. You can see it in the draft protocol. Eligibility quantification items is, the verifier would go through protocol sections 2 and 3 up to 6, where this is kind of the first 2 or 3 work group meetings that we talked about, where they're checking start dates and ownership, and that the SCM meets the project definition. So all about, when we're talking about eligible and ineligible products. It meets the performance standard test, which is, around the eligibility of market or business as usual products, etc. I added in here 3.6 that they would also verify that it meets any applicable ASTM standards as well. So basically a desk review or verification of what is included in terms of the product eligibility and its start date and all of that. Following that, there's more like the quantification section and items that would be verified. So everything we went through today in terms of all the different SSRs, are they all included? Were the baseline emissions properly aggregated or accounted for, all the way down to project emissions. So this is basically going through the verification or checklist of what we have already gone through to date, and what would be checked. So you're free, obviously, to look at this and make comments, but it is very much tied to things we've already discussed, in a list of what would be verified based on what's included in the protocol. The one thing that I added at the bottom here, and I think we could have more discussion on that potentially, is verify the SCM. ACM is displaced, that it has displaced Portland cement at the cement facility or ready mixed concrete plant through review of sales receipts and sales volumes. So I think we could build on a section to better explain what we're looking for here in terms of batch receipts or documentation. I know as well, our colleague John is working on a protocol for biochar and its similar supply chain questions. And there's, the potential to have like an attestation form or document that the concrete, ready mix purchaser could check off and sign, saying that they bought this product, they intend to use it instead of, Portland cement or other options, something like that. So we can, we've started to draft for your review, but we'll share at a later date. And then finally, there's also items that inform a risk assessment that are verified. This includes things like responsible, like team verifying the individual or team responsible for managing and reporting project activities is qualified to perform this function. Reviewing monitoring equipment in place. So this could be something that's done at a site visit, for instance, if there's things set up to monitor electricity or fuel usage, to ensure that's accurate. Training, contractors. So just assessing any outside risks that could potentially impact the quantification and therefore the emission reductions that's reported. So I know we're just at the top of the hour now, so I will pause and not go into the follow-up slides. Thank you all for your attention. I'm happy to say we made it through the slides that we had for quantification and MRV. I think we've got definitely a few kind of main themes that have come up around the EPDs and how we're aligning with those. So internally, to Craig's point, we'll further look into that. I think this is a first for us potentially with how we're going to align with the EPDs within the supply chain and chain of custody for cement production. So we'll look into that further and bring back more for your consideration. In terms of next steps, always feel free to email us with any feedback on any topic that was discussed or other items. Whenever you need to, you have our direct emails. We're kind of questioning, do we need an additional work group meeting? I think likely there's probably a few follow-up items that have come out of today's discussion, as well as some we didn't get to. So you'll probably see an email from me looking to schedule another couple-hour work group meeting in the next few weeks. I've posted the version 3 of the protocol on SharePoint and shared it as well via email. So if you do have any additional comments that weren't captured today, feel free to make them in that version or send them directly to myself. And then we'll work on drafting a next version 4 for your review. So all that being said, you'll have another follow-up email from me in your inbox in the next day or two with next steps. And we'll work to include these edits that we heard today into a next version and for a next discussion. Any last questions, comments, concerns from the work group before we close off here at the end of the hour? Okay, well, thank you again for your time. Again, on a Friday, probably afternoon for you both, for most of you. So thank you again, and have a good weekend, and you'll hear from us shortly.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.